make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Yes, I wrote in the Da Vinci Code, or read it in the Da Vinci Code, and they just voted on Jesus existing in 325 AD or whatever, and they all wrote that in later. That was just what response do we have to that?
These are not 4th century documents. These are documents that come from a couple hundred years or more earlier, and there's no debate in historical circles about their date. In the case of Josephus, there is some debate because in some copies, in the majority of the copies that we have, Josephus says some things that it's not likely that a Jew who never became a Christian would have said. He simply calls Jesus the Messiah, and he simply refers to resurrection appearances. But we also have translations into other ancient languages of Josephus where those bits are missing, and where Josephus says things like the so-called Messiah. And so it's true that there may have been a slight bit of Christian editing in some of the manuscripts at a later date, particularly because Josephus did become more popular in Christian circles, even than in Jewish circles. But you can isolate those places, and there's really no reason to question the rest of Josephus' testimony. And even if you do, there's no reason to question the various Greek and Roman testimonies, because you don't have the same kind of issues there.
Hello, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're joining us on YouTube, this is Josh Bertram, your ever faithful host on Faithful Politics, and our political host, Will, couldn't be with us today. He is currently doing secret missions in Latin America. So we will continue without him. And we have today Dr. Craig Blomberg, who is the professor at Denver Theological Seminary. He has written more books than I can even quote. How many books has it been now, Dr. Craig?
Well, if you count those I've done with others, about 30.
30 books. That is amazing. And you have been a New Testament professor at Denver for how long?
I came there at 86, so was there full-time for 35 years, and now I'm part-time in retirement, so I guess we're up to 37.
37 years. Was that the first seminary that you worked at?
It's the first seminary. I taught for 3 years at Palm Beach Atlantic College, now university in South Florida, but that was short-lived in comparison.
Gotcha. So, well, we're so happy to have you on the program here today. Anyone who's been around the New Testament long enough, or has been around and reading, and certainly in any kind of evangelical circles, and certainly beyond that, would come across your name at some point. Dr. Craig Blomberg, in one of these studies that we've been going through, I remember, like we were talking a little bit before, that I had your historical reliability of the Gospels in my Jesus in the Gospels course in undergrad, and we were reminiscing on how long ago that was and feeling old together. So, but you're still a sprightly young man still writing books after all these years.
Well, you've still got a lot of black hair. I don't have that.
That's true. So you've been writing for a long time, studying for a long time. We have a broad audience here that listens and watches. kind of just introduce yourself, like from your own perspective, like how did you get here to where you are today as a retired but still very active New Testament professor at Denver Theological Seminary?
Well, I grew up in Western Illinois in a Lutheran family, and in the 1960s, when unfortunately in a lot of mainline Protestant churches, confirmation was the ticket to leave church. You'd put in your time, you'd said the right things, and I don't know that many of the kids that I was confirmed with stayed in the church. But when I was in high school, I was introduced to a campus life club where I saw a very different attitude among my peers, where faith seemed to not just be something you gave assent to on Sunday morning, but actually affected how you lived during the week. And I wanted that. So I count my real coming to faith as praying for that in February of 1971 when I was a sophomore in high school.
Wow.
Didn't think it would affect my vocation. My parents were both public school teachers. I was good in math and good at explaining it to friends who were struggling. So I set out to be a high school math teacher. And after an illustrious one-year career, I changed directions and went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. Got an MA in New Testament, and then found a wife as a bonus, and we headed off to Aberdeen, Scotland, in a pre-internet world in the fall of 1979 for doctoral studies under a man who at that time was perhaps evangelicalism's premier New Testament scholar, or soon would become that, I. Howard Marshall. And knowing full well from people in seminary that there were more academically trained Bible scholars than paying positions available for them, and realizing I might have to go back to teaching high school math, but God was gracious and gave me the position in South Florida, and then came here in 1986 and have been blessed with being able to travel the world and teach and speak in a lot of different places. But Colorado is a wonderful place to keep coming back to and calling home.
Yes, that's great. I've been to Colorado a couple times, and such beautiful land out there, at least the west part of the state. The east part is kind of flat, and there's not much.
Very flat.
There.
We're right in the middle, so we're right at the base of the foothills, and you're in the pretty part.
Yes, that's where you want to be. You want to be there in the pretty part. So you got into writing about the Gospels, and I'd love to get into some of the stuff you talked in your book. The first half was essentially a recapitulation of the last, several hundred years, but then even focusing on the last few decades of Jesus research. You go through the different quests. You talk about a fourth quest, and we'll get into all that. But again, we have a wide audience, and they don't even know what a quest. When you say quest, they're thinking, what are they going on an adventure or something? What's happening? Are they going on an adventure with Jesus? It's just another Christianese thing. So what are we talking about? Like when we're talking about studying Jesus. So one of your expertise is obviously the historical Jesus. And there's a lot of people, I've heard them say, well, how do we even know Jesus existed? Maybe it's just something that was made up by all these crazy people that wanted power. Donald Trump made Jesus up. So what, you don't have to respond to that necessarily, but kind of talk to us about the historical Jesus. How do we even, what is that area of research, and what does it try to tell us, and what can't, let's just talk about Jesus, the historical Jesus?
Well, we get the word quest not from an adventure novel, but from an amazing man who lived from the late 19th century until 1965 by the name of Albert Schweitzer, who was really a polymath. He had doctorates in biblical studies and psychology. He had a MD. He was a medical doctor, and he was a concert organist. And by the age of 30, he had already written what would become his most famous book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And then he went off and was a Nobel Peace-winning medical missionary in West Africa for the rest of his career. What Schweitzer did was to survey in an age when there weren't nearly the helps for research that we have today. He simply read a few hundred books in several languages in order to survey what people had been saying from the late 18th century onward. The idea that Jesus never lived is not a modern invention. There have been people who have floated that idea off and on throughout history. There are people long before Donald Trump, going back to the first century, who have been talking about Jesus. So if Jesus was invented, he was invented by a whole lot of people very soon after the time he supposedly lived. And nobody's ever come up with a plausible explanation for how that could happen. Christians didn't have any power for another 3 centuries. They were very much an oppressed minority under the Roman Empire. But sensible people have nevertheless still asked the question, what can we know if we are just wearing our historian's hats? Take off a believer's hat, take off an unbeliever's hat, try to look at the evidence.
Craig, so can you just pause for one moment and kind of talk about that for a second? I know you're about to go into and looking at the evidence, but what does it mean to take off my historian's hat or my believer's hat, my theologian's hat, and put on a historical hat?
I use criteria and evidence and methods of historical research that are widely accepted by people of all different approaches. I don't start out and say, God said it, I believe it, that settles it for me, when I'm trying to talk with people who don't start with that starting point that God said it. I ask, what can we talk about as somebody would talk about in a world history class without, I don't have to believe that Alexander the Great was a god. I don't have to worship him in order to say I know an awful lot of things about what he did during his life and his influence. Well, let's do that with Jesus, and not that it becomes a substitute for Christian faith for those who have it, but that we want to see how far we can get in a conversation with common ground with those who don't share our starting points.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So when we're talking about so the historical Jesus again, and one thing I appreciated about your book was you got into the methodology quite a bit more, and maybe not more than I know that a lot of people do that, but I appreciated your effort to get into the methodology. What are some of the methods that are used to determine, say that Alexander the Great, did this or that, and that Jesus did this or that, right? Because Jesus didn't leave any stels, right? He didn't leave any inscriptions, personally. We don't even have anything that he personally wrote. We don't think, at least that we know of, right? So what do we do? How do we even begin to figure this out?
Well, the typical summary of Alexander's life in a world civilizations textbook is based on the biographies of him by two men who wrote around the end of the first, beginning of the second century by the names of Arian and Plutarch, and we're not aware that they knew one another or in any way depended on each other. So one of the foundational criteria of history is the more independent attestation or witnesses that you have to an individual or a period of time where they agree on information, the greater likelihood there is of it being true. Another fundamental principle is when you discover a particular historian's bias. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived at the end of the first century, was writing to Roman emperors to convince them that the Jewish religion was a good thing and not dangerous and nothing to be afraid of or nothing to persecute. And so we know when we come to his work that he's going to try to put Judaism in the best possible light for a Roman audience. That tells me that when there are awkward or embarrassing things that he nevertheless includes in his history, there must have been some pretty strong evidence for those things for him to go ahead and include them because it sort of cuts against the grain. And you can do that with the Gospels as well. Jesus was very quickly being very exalted and even worshipped in Christianity. So what do we do with the awkward bits? What do we do with the hard to explain bits? That would be a second criterion that people could use. Another one would be what fits remarkably well with local customs and practices, especially when they varied, perhaps even from one part of a century to another or from one location to another. Do the authors get it right for the very precise time and place, especially if they're writing from a different time and place? So those are some that one can start with.
Right. So if let me focus on the you call them criterion, right? So you got people like when we're thinking about criterion, we're thinking about in terms of Jesus' study, right? There's specific criterions that are used, like the criterion of authenticity. You talk about the criterion of double similarity and double dissimilarity. You talk about the criterion of embarrassment. And the idea behind embarrassment is that you wouldn't include something if you're making it up. That was like, the idea is that if I were to try to write something and my bias was that, my mother is a great person and there's some story about my mother, though, that is against that, and I include it in there. But, then that is like, hey, he included that, even though that doesn't necessarily fit well with his initial theory, right? So it's like when someone when someone has to deal with evidence that doesn't fit, we wrestle with it. Is that the kind of idea that we have there?
Early church tradition from the 2nd century onward says that the Gospel of Mark got much of his information from Peter. And one of the fascinating things about Mark's Gospel is it has the most negative portrait of Peter and to a certain degree of all the disciples, their fears, their failures. That's not likely to have been included really by anybody in the first century, but especially by someone who could link himself to Peter unless it was true and it was important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there's one thing I wanted you to touch on, right? Because again, we're talking about the historical Jesus, because a lot of people here, like we have an audience of atheists, people who don't share, the views of Christianity. And so we would be able to say confidently, for anyone listening, Jesus existed. That's like, you can say that without any, what else can we say where you're like, we're completely confident, like as confident as we can be in a historical figure. Jesus did what would you say?
Well, different scholars have different levels of confidence that they require in order to put together a list like that. My list would be longer than some, but let me give you a list that would be pretty representative across the spectrum of scholars today. It might go something like this. Jesus was an early first century Jew, born and raised to a very Jewish family, brought up in Nazareth, learned scriptures at synagogue school, and learned a trade, carpentry, which maybe included stoneworking, with his family. As an adult, somewhere around the age of 30, discovered that a man by the name of John was baptizing lots of people along the Jordan River in different places for the repentance of sins, and announcing that there was a coming one who would far eclipse his own ministry and would baptize with the Holy Spirit as well as with water. Jesus submitted to that baptism. That's virtually guaranteed, because then you have to ask, is he repenting from sin? Well, no, not necessarily, but he may have been.
That's another criterion of embarrassment kind of thing?
That's right. He may have been identifying with the sins of his people. People thought corporately much more than individually in the first century. He gathered disciples, but unlike the traditional rabbi, he went out and called those he wanted. He didn't wait for people to come to him and then sift through the contenders. The fact that he chose 12 along with a whole lot of his teaching suggests that in some way he saw himself as reconstituting a new or a true Israel with those who followed him. He loved to hang out with the most wicked and outcast of his society. There would be widespread agreement today, unlike in some ages, that what appeared to people to be miraculous healings and exorcisms, casting out of demons, was something that really took place. There would be disagreement as to how it actually took place, whether it was genuinely miraculous or something else, mind over matter, power of suggestion. He came into conflict repeatedly with interpretations of the law with the Jewish authorities of his day. He was eventually arrested, executed by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, which narrows it down to 26 to 36 AD, the 10 years that Pilate reigned. And yet, despite that, a large and growing number of people came to believe he was the Jewish Messiah. A large number came to believe that they saw him resurrected from the dead. Notice that I phrase that in a way a historian would.
Yes,
I'm not saying it happened or it didn't happen. And the movement that he followed grew remarkably quickly for his world, to such a point that, as Pliny near the end of the first century says, a Roman ruler, people began to meet weekly and sing hymns to him, worshiping him as if he were a god.
Wow. And that's from a Roman leader that would have absolutely zero reason to make up it. How do we know that some Christian didn't write that in?
To make stuff up, but was in fact asking the Roman Emperor Trajan at that time, what do I do with these Christians? Because persecution and even execution had been ordered, and he's trying to find out how hard he's supposed to come down on these Christians.
He's trying to figure out, he's asking a policy question to
That's right.
the emperor, right? Because they're all about keeping order and keeping peace so that Rome keeps power.
That's right.
Correct? That's their big thing.
Yep.
So if I were to say that to someone, like, hey, Pliny, the elder, is it Pliny the Elder? Is that the one who wrote it? Or the younger? Governor, okay. So Pliny, the governor, wrote it to Trajan, or, you have certain evidence from Tacitus and Josephus, though there's some debate. So what if someone was like, well, that's just an edit. Like later on, I heard it from Dan Brown. And I read it in the the Jesus whatever book. I'm forgetting the book that he wrote. Yeah, the Da Vinci Code. Yes, I wrote in the Da Vinci Code. I read it in the Da Vinci Code, and they just voted on Jesus existing in 325 A.D. or whatever, and they all wrote that in later. That was just what response do we have to that?
These are not 4th century documents. These are documents that come from a couple hundred years or more earlier, and there's no debate in historical circles about their date. In the case of Josephus, there is some debate because in some copies, in the majority of the copies that we have, Josephus says some things that it's not likely that a Jew who never became a Christian would have said. He simply calls Jesus the Messiah, and he simply refers to resurrection appearances. But we also have translations into other ancient languages of Josephus where those bits are missing, and where Josephus says things like the so-called Messiah. And so it's true that there may have been a slight bit of Christian editing in some of the manuscripts at a later date, particularly because Josephus did become more popular in Christian circles, even than in Jewish circles. But you can isolate those places, and there's really no reason to question the rest of Josephus' testimony. And even if you do, there's no reason to question the various Greek and Roman testimonies, because you don't have the same kind of issues there.
Right. That makes sense. So, like, if I'm looking at, let's just say, the resurrection, the event of the resurrection, right? Because that's the turn, like that's the key event, right? That's what everything in Christianity kind of, it relies on that. It's founded on that. Right. So as a historian, like I'm approaching this as a Christian, right? I have deep belief and I have deep faith. And I think I talk to Jesus every day. Very personally, I think I can talk to him and all that stuff. So I'm going to approach this, right? The resurrection historically. And my friend who's a Muslim is going to approach it very differently. Right. And I've talked with him about it, and we've had some conversations. How can he and I know you've talked about this, but I'm trying to bring it into scenarios that we will, normal lay people will come across, right? And they're like, hey, dude, they made up the crucifixion, they made up the resurrection. Right. And many people say that. Right. So how do I even approach something like the resurrection, a supernatural event where I'm saying God raised Jesus from the dead? I can't prove that to somebody. Right. Scientifically. You can't prove anything from history scientifically, can you, that it happened? I don't know. That's why I'm talking to you, and that's why but and I'm sure you have many thoughts rolling around in your head, right, about how one might respond. But I'm assuming that he and I can use the same tools, right, and approach Jesus in the exact same way, even though we come up with very different interpretations of reality at the end. How do you approach it as a historian?
We have
what
to.
do we do this?
And in some ways, it may even be harder for the average Muslim who may not have ever had exposure to the kind of Western university approach to religion that asks these questions. But if he and I, or she and I, are both willing to bracket our faith commitments and simply say, I'm not going to believe something simply because it's in the Bible. I'm not going to believe something simply because it's in the Quran. What evidence do I have? I can say there is, from the oldest known sources outside of Scripture, Christian and non-Christian, the belief, and that's why I have to describe it that way. It's a historical statement to say, from as far back as we can go, people who followed Jesus believed he was bodily resurrected from the dead. Then the question that historians can't answer as historians is, was that a genuine supernatural event that provoked that belief? Was it one of the many ways that people have suggested naturalistically? People went to the wrong tomb. Jesus never really died. The body was stolen, et cetera, et cetera. So false things that provoke that belief. And we can discuss those options, put as many of them on the table as you can think of, and then weigh their probability historically. If they went to the wrong tomb, well, wouldn't have taken long for them to find the right tomb. If they stole the body, which was in the Bible, in Matthew, the oldest counterclaim that anybody came up with that we know of, then we know that the apostles lived their entire lives knowing that what they were doing was based on a lie. And sometimes people will say, well, Muslims are willing to be martyred for what Christians think is a lie. But the difference is they're not doing it knowing that it's a lie. They're believing passionately that it's the truth, which is a huge difference. So I'm not going to, by historical or scientific methods alone, be able to say the resurrection really happened, or Jesus turned water into wine, or he fed the 5,000. We have to have a conversation that goes back to the possibility of miracle, the probability of miracle. We have to face David Hume's argument square in the face from 18th century Scotland, where he said, I'm not claiming miracles are impossible. I'm just claiming that there's always better evidence and testimony for something that's natural rather than supernatural, a claim which in philosophical circles has widely been debunked, but the aggressive atheists, as they're sometimes called, of our day aren't always aware of that, or
the new four horsemen or three horsemen now, I guess. I don't know.
Exactly. And at some point, faith is very much a part of any religious commitment. But the question is it faith that continues in the direction and with the momentum that the historical evidence is propelling them, or is it faith in spite of the preponderance of the evidence, or is it faith utterly unrelated to the historical evidence?
Seeing that, and you can have all those sorts of faith, right? And people do. Right. They have all those different kinds of faith commitments. And sometimes, well, it's just a test of my faith if I will believe this is historical or not. Well, no, and here's the thing, though. It's not historical whether this is true or not. Because here's what I'm picking up, and I've picked this up, for a while. But when we're talking about history, to talk about something being true and what happened and something being history are not the same thing.
That's right.
So help explain the difference. And I know we've been kind of talking about this, but explain the difference for someone who's like, no, like that's like if it happened, it's history. It either happened or didn't happen. So
if my definition of history is broad enough to allow for a supernatural agency, traditionally known as God, then I can make that equation. But if my definition of history is what can be demonstrated via agreed upon criteria that do not require belief in God, then my understanding of history is more limited. And it's going to have to say, at some point, this is as far as I can go, to go back to my metaphor, wearing just my historian's hat.
And so it has to be in history. It's like you have to be able to find something, right? Because academically, when we're talking about history, you're talking about written records, correct? I mean, the time at which there are now written records, not that they didn't have records before, right? They had paintings or whatever, an oral record, but it's just written records. So that makes sense. When we're looking at the Jesus story, and we're looking at the evidence for the Jesus story, say someone is going and they look at Luke, right? And they look at the two stories, it's Christmas time, and they look at the two stories and they're like, did this all happen at the same time? How is this possible? Are these angels or whatever? Okay. Again, we have supernatural. We've kind of dealt with some of that. History can't answer. Like history isn't subject to the same tests as, say, like some kind of like gravity or some kind of scientific principle, right? It's just not subject to the same kinds of tests of
science. By definition, is that which can be repeated and studied, and preferably under laboratory conditions. History, by definition, is what has happened in the past, and therefore cannot be repeated, and studied, preferably under laboratory conditions.
So, okay, so that makes sense, but it's like we've almost taken scientific and we've just said, when we put scientific, that means real, or that means true. It's scientific. It's true. But that's not what that means.
I've had people tell me that very candidly and to their credit, very honestly, their starting point in evaluating matters of religion is that they will accept only that which can be empirically demonstrated. And the irony is that theorem or that starting point or that premise is not itself based on anything that can be empirically demonstrated. So they contradict themselves with their own starting point.
And that's the hard thing, isn't it? Because it comes down to it's so much of this is a philosophical question at some level. And what is the kinds of evidence we can use? Like, what are the kinds of evidence that are acceptable? And then how do we even evaluate those?
It actually, if you were to take that approach, it actually proves too much, so to speak, because I love the line in Sully, the story of the pilot who landed the airplane on the Hudson River a little bit over a decade ago and saved everybody on board. When he's being interrogated by lawyers for the insurance companies, and I don't know if this happened in real life, but it's a great line in the movie. And they're talking about the possibility of a double bird strike taking out both engines. And one of the lawyers says that would be unprecedented in the history of aviation. And Sullivan calmly responds, everything is unprecedented until the first time it happens. So if you are going to take out anything that cannot be empirically demonstrated because something like it has happened before, then you take out all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the supernatural at all, that are acknowledged history that you might have even lived through and know to be true.
Right. Yeah. You can't. It's like, yeah, like if you were to take everything that's improbable and say it didn't happen, there'd be very little that you could say was actually like the probability of me being here. You know, how do you even calculate that probability? You know what I'm saying? Like, ultimately, it's like, it's ridiculous in some sense, right? And everything I do is this unique thing in my life. And yet there's so much that's carried on that's
one of the
other
remarkable things about human agency is that we have the freedom to invent. We have the freedom to do new things. We have the ability to do unpredictable things.
We can do unpredictable things, and we can write beautiful poems, or not. That's not what I meant. You can write beautiful works of literature that are meant to, you know, portray truth, and we can be stylistic, and we can do all these things, but that doesn't mean it's not representative of some kind of truth, right? And I want, so help us understand for a moment, like, what even are Gospels? Like, we talk about them. Some people think they're biographies. Some people think they're just legends, right? Some people think all this stuff. How do we even try to understand, like, because if I come to the Gospels and I try to read them like I would read a Wall Street Journal article, or if I try to come and read them like I would read, Isaacson's, a biography on any number of people, Einstein, right? There's going to be remarkable differences. Number one, in the size, the detail, the things that are chosen to even talk about. So help us understand, what is a gospel? What are we looking at it when we're reading the Gospels?
Well, what we're looking at is that which purports to be a historical narrative, primarily about the life and exploits of an individual first century Jew who is described highly selectively. Two of the four Gospels give brief remarks about his birth and early years. Two of them don't do that at all. All of them pick up the story when his life intersects with that of another prominent Jewish preacher of the day, John the Baptist. And then in some combination of chronological and topical or thematic sequence, gives representative stories, representative teachings from this man's adult life, which lasted from the moment he went public for about 3 years. And then in a very disproportionate way, the narrative time slows way down, like when the adventure mystery discovers the ticking bomb that's going to explode in 10 minutes, but it takes a half an hour of real time in the movie to find out what happens. It's not that extreme in the Gospels, but both Mark and John devote almost half of their narratives to the last months, and then disproportionately to the last week of Jesus' life. If I go looking in the rather large pool of existing Jewish, Greek, and Roman literature from the few centuries before and during and after the time of Jesus, I actually can find quite a number of works that fit what I just described, and they are all historical or biographical in nature, but they are all also ideologically based, because nobody in the ancient world had even invented the idea that there could be value in recounting a period of history or someone's life if they thought it had no value.
Right.
There had to be some reason for it.
Right. So a historian writing at the time, they're just writing good history to have bias, right? They're just writing good history to have, I mean, even whether they even say that.
And so
yes.
They are going to be selective in what they include and not include. And the fact that the Gospels in the New Testament do contain so much that doesn't directly support their overall biases to get people to follow and worship Jesus is, again, something that you don't find in many other biographies and histories. So that becomes telling. So,
I mean, this is just remarkable, and I want to shift, moving over into talking about Jesus the purifier and even the purity. You know, there's so many questions I have about this. We'll have to be careful with our time and everything. But so, but before I move on to and shift in that direction, this is such a fascinating conversation to me, because there are so many people that are so misinformed when it comes to Jesus, you know, and there are so many. I remember years ago at an airport and sitting there eating, and someone came and sat next to me, and we got in a conversation about Jesus. And got in a conversation about what Jesus was a historical person. And this person said, I don't think he was historical. And they were a PhD. They're in a PhD. And looking back on it now, I'm like, wow, I don't even know. Maybe they made that whole thing up, because they don't seem to have, they weren't very critical. Like, looking back, I was like an undergrad, and I was just trying to pull things out that I had heard in class. And you know, but I remember them saying, "Oh, well, you know, you got to show me the evidence of it. You got to show me. Oh, you don't remember where that is? See, I need to know exactly where where those parts are, like Tacitus and Josephus and stuff like that, because they're somewhere, you know." But it's like people have this, they have this animus towards Jesus that they wouldn't have towards Caesar, you know, or towards very few other, certainly, historical figures of the ancient world, maybe more recently. So, when it's coming to how we actually even, when we're sitting there reading the Gospels and figuring out, who am I actually, what am I reading? Who is this person behind the words? Do you feel like on a personal level, how important do you think it is to be asking those questions about, Luke says this, but does that what Jesus really said? I guess I'm trying to figure out the question is not coming out right, but it's really about someone's faith and someone's, when they're looking at these Gospels, and there's so much debate, and there's so much scholarly, all this stuff. And we're we just want a simple faith. We just want a simple faith, but it doesn't seem that simple. It seems very complicated. It seems like there's these massive historical questions that are difficult. And how does a normal person who doesn't even have access to any of this stuff, how do they even figure this? How do they even figure this out?
Well, we are amazingly blessed in today's world because we have access to untold resources at the tip of our fingers, literally click a few buttons. I was very curious when the artificial intelligence programs first started to come out, and I have a browser that uses Bing, and so I was experimenting with Bing AI and thought, let's see, a few years ago when there was a Google program that you could talk to and it would answer back, our pastor illustrated in the middle of a message how when he asked it, does God exist? The answer was something like, I'm not able to address that question. But Bing AI gave me 2 detailed, amazingly well-balanced paragraphs that said, people disagree on this. Here are some of the key arguments for. Here are some of the key arguments against. This is something you ought to follow up further with and think reflectively on. And ultimately, history and science are not going to prove anything one way or the other, and there's going to be an element of faith. And I thought, wow, I couldn't have written anything better if I were just trying to be objective. So whoever programmed that did a remarkably good job. To answer your question, you can go to 2 extremes, both of which I think are unhealthy. One is to say, I'm never going to make a decision on an important matter of life because there's always possibility I'll discover more information. We don't do that. We don't do that with things affecting our physical lives. If we're not confident in what one doctor says for whatever reason, we will get a second opinion. We might even get a third opinion. But do I get chemo for the cancer that someone was diagnosed with or not? I've got a limited amount of time to make that decision, or I know my life is going to be adversely affected. And so based on what I know at the moment, I do the best I can. If I do that with my physical life, I should surely be at least as careful, but then willing to make a commitment with my spiritual life. On the other hand, it would be nice to have a simple faith. It would be nice to live in a simple world. It would be nice to sing with John Lennon, Imagine There's No Heaven or hell either. But there are so many examples of hell on earth that's not a reasonable approach to take to life. If I were living in Ukraine right now,
you might be singing a different tune.
And I have friends who are living there and living through the war, and no one has to be convinced that these matters of life and death aren't significant. And no one is claiming they just want a simple faith. They want a solid faith. They want faith in the right things. But life is not simple.
No, life is not simple. It's not simple at all. And I think it wasn't simple for Jesus. Right. It was not simple for Jesus, not in the least. And he came and he did what, we believe he did what we needed, what all of us needed. When we're looking at like the Gospels and like, I'm trying to get this out right because as you were speaking, it hit me a few times. That, we have our faith that we all have to wrestle with, that we all have to work our own sense of what we believe, what we don't believe, how do you, like, personally keep your faith and remain objective? And what I mean is, like, so, you mentioned something like we all have to be open to new things coming in, right? We all have to be open. I remember listening to this lecture, New Testament theology, or, New Testament survey or whatever, lecture with Moises Silva. And he was talking about inerrancy, right? And he was talking about the authority of Scripture. And he says, well, when you begin to put the authority of science over the authority of Scripture, right? And he's obviously extremely intelligent, right? So it's not like he hasn't thought through this. It's like when you do that, you essentially are saying, yeah, I'm going to judge the standards of the Scriptures by human standards. I'm elevating the standards of, whatever it is. And he wasn't saying we shouldn't use, clearly he uses all the historical tools available, as a huge believer in the historical grammatical method and looking all the full use of the tools that we need and have to understand the Scriptures and what happened in its original audience. But this idea that, like, what if all this, like, evidence came out and it was starting to lead you down a path that you didn't feel like your faith could take you?
Right.
And that's for everyone, right? It's not just a Christian issue. It is with
of course.
Jesus, may be more specific. But the same thing can be said for an atheist that started getting led down the path where they're starting to believe. How can they remain objective?
Absolutely. I've sometimes had fun conversations with people, or even classes, when I've asked the question, if it could be definitively shown that we have discovered bones of Jesus, would you still be a Christian? Notwithstanding what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15, 12 to 19, where he says, if Christ be not raised, our faith is in vain, and we are of all people most miserable. It is remarkable how many people, especially believers, will say that they didn't have to give up their faith. I liken that to what, as you say, atheists and those of other religions do when they are presented with something that seemingly conclusively contradicts their belief. If we say in principle we would never change our mind, then what's the point of any conversation? What's the point of reading anybody other than people who simply reinforce our already existing biases? Now, having said that, where a faith commitment does have an effect is if you have tested time and again apparent challenges to a certain worldview, and sometimes perhaps after considerable investigation, you find, oh, okay, now there's something that makes sense and that convinces me, then the logical thing, the thing, again, that a rational historian will do is to say, there is so much evidence here that it's going to take something overwhelming, like not just an apparent contradiction on minor details between two gospel accounts, but something like the resurrection of Jesus being contradicted by a discovery of his bones for me to change my view. But I think the only way, to use philosophical terms, the only way that a view can be considered verifiable is if it can also be falsifiable.
So the question was, how do you keep your objectivity when you are looking at, the Gospels?
Right.
And if, like, you had mentioned, like, about your students when they had you asked him the question about what if it was discovered that Jesus'
Right.
bones, we found their bones.
Well,
So
I like what Howard Marshall wrote, my PhD supervisor from years ago, that a historian develops a sense of the reliability or unreliability of a document as they study it. And the more they study it, the more they have a sense where on a spectrum from totally unreliable to totally reliable would you place something. And the more that general impression favors reliability, it's only natural, it's only part of the historical enterprise that you are going to want stronger counter evidence before you change your views. I'm going to want something like the bones of Jesus and not just, here's another problem, how to reconcile two discrepant gospel accounts on some fairly minor detail. But to use philosophical language, a view, a tenet cannot be called verifiable if it cannot also be falsifiable. If I say flat out, there is nothing under the sun that could ever change my mind on this, then you have what philosophers call fideism, a belief just by pure faith. I've met a lot of those people in political debates on both the right and the left. Don't confuse me with the facts. I'm going to believe my conspiracy theory no matter what. And hardly any point in having a conversation with such people on those topics. But if you're open, even though you say it's going to take that UFO from outer space to land on my head as well as to whisk me up before I'll believe that kind of stuff happens. But it could, however remotely, well, then you have a defensible view that combines the results of your historical investigation and your faith commitment that has been built up on that basis.
Yeah, and I love that answer. I think it's a great answer. I think when I'm contemplating the whole issue, it's like it's weird to feel like you can never be 100% sure.
But you're never 100% sure of anything.
Anything. Yeah, totally.
I'm going to make the radical prediction that when you sat down for the first time in the chair you're in this morning, you did not carefully check it out to make sure that there weren't any new cracks or things that would make it collapse on you. You were not 100% certain, but you sat down anyway. You had pretty strong confidence based on previous experience.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. So here's the last question for the interview today, and we're going to schedule another time to go more in depth on the other half of the book. We kind of concentrated on the first, but we didn't even get to the fourth quest and all that stuff. But we will talk more about it, and we'll schedule another date. But we have a lot of people, right, that watch the program, listen to it from a lot of different political and religious viewpoints. What would you want them to hear from you about Jesus, like about the historical Jesus? What would you want them to hear from you? As let's even just say someone who has no faith at all. Let's address people that have faith, people that have no faith. What would you want both? You can address one at a time. What would you want them to hear?
I would want them to hear my conviction, which is not idiosyncratic. It's the conviction that has been held by hundreds of millions, if not over 1 billion people in the current world and in the history of the world, that what you decide about the person of Jesus of Nazareth is the single most important decision you can make in life. If the traditional Christian claims are true, then there is not only the question of how the rest of this life will look for you, but for an eternity. And as the famous British Christian novelist and literary critic C.S. Lewis put it, you have never met a mortal person. Everyone will live forever. And what the nature of that existence is like, Christians say, depends on how you respond to Jesus. Are you willing, if you're currently not a believer, to take the risk, however remote you think it might be, that that claim is true? Or shouldn't you investigate it in some detail? And to the believer, I would quote my former seminary supervisor, Don Carson, who currently, along with Tim Keller, before he passed away, was co-chair of the Gospel Coalition, and say, if we make decisions about things in this life, and I will quote him, without taking the nature of existence 50 billion years from now into account, we have not even begun to think like a Christian, close quote.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Craig. Dr. Craig, should I call you Your Majesty? I always.
Oh, heavens no. We just celebrated the 4th of July.
Yes. But it's been such a pleasure to have you on today. How can people stay connected with your work? Can they, what do they, how can they keep up to date?
New books regularly are available on Google. The Denver Seminary website, which is simply denverseminary.edu, has information about faculty. I am on Facebook, but I usually, if I accept somebody as a friend that I don't know, I would like them to introduce themselves to me. But
just say you heard them on the Faithful Politics podcast.
There you go. I don't have a personal website, but people don't have trouble finding me.
Well, good. Well, thank you again. This has been Dr. Craig Blomberg, author of multiple books. The newest one, Jesus the Purifier, which we recommend you all pick up, and we'll have another one to talk about that, the second half of that one, a little bit more in depth. But thank you so much, Greg, and thanks everyone Craig, thanks everyone for listening, and we will see you next time. God bless.